A mother, German shepherd, stood trembling on the edge of Pinecrest Pass, her weary body acting as a shield for 3 tiny puppies fading in the bitter cold. Their fur was frozen stiff, their cries swallowed by the roar of the worst blizzard in a decade. No one was supposed to stop on that death trap of a road. But fate had other plans. A police officer, driving through the storm with a shattered soul and a resignation letter in his pocket, saw them through the blinding blur of snow. 4 lives hanging by a single thread. When he opened his patrol car door and reached out his trembling hand, something in both of them changed forever. What happened next will make you believe that even the coldest hearts can thaw when love finds its way. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The mountains of Montana did not just receive snow, they were devoured by it. By late afternoon, the town of Blackwood Ridge had vanished beneath a suffocating shroud of white. High above, at Pinecrest Pass, the wind shrieked through the jagged peaks like a wounded predator, visibility dropping to a mere few feet as the worst blizzard in a decade turned the world into a chaotic, freezing void. Officer Lucas Thorne sat behind the wheel of his Ford Expedition Patrol unit, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. At 36, Lucas carried the physical presence of a man built for the rugged north. He was broad-shouldered and tall, with a frame hardened by years of tactical training. His face was a map of stoicism, a sharp, angular jawline partially hidden by a dark, salt-and-pepper stubble, and eyes the color of flint, cold, observant, and weary. Once known for a quick wit and a steady smile, he had become a ghost in his own uniform. Since the shootout 18 months ago that claimed the life of his partner and best friend, Marcus, Lucas had retreated into a fortress of silence. He was a man of few words, his movements precise and robotic, his heart seemingly cauterized by grief and the persistent, gnawing shadows of PTSD. The heater hummed, but it couldn't drown out the silence. To Lucas, silence was the loudest sound in the world. Every time the wind died down for a fraction of a second, his mind filled the gap with the sharp, rhythmic crack-crack-crack of gunfire. The phantom smell of cordite often stung his nostrils in the middle of a grocery store or a quiet forest trail. Pinned to the sun visor was a resignation letter, signed and dated for the following Monday. He was done. He couldn't protect a world that felt like a firing range. As he maneuvered the heavy vehicle through a treacherous curve near the summit of the pass, his spotlights cut through the swirling drift. A dark shape caught the corner of his eye. It was huddled in a shallow, limestone alcove, nearly buried by the rising powder. "Probably just a fallen branch," he muttered, his voice raspy from disuse, but his training wouldn't let him keep driving. He tapped the brakes, the SUV sliding slightly before the tires bit into the slush. He stepped out, and the Montana winter slapped him with the force of a physical blow. The air was 20 degrees Celsius, a searing cold that threatened to freeze the moisture in his lungs. He drew his heavy tactical flashlight, the beam slicing through the white curtain. There, shivering violently, was a German shepherd. She was a magnificent creature, or at least she had been. Her coat, a mixture of deep sable and midnight black, was matted with ice crystals. She was large, likely 60 pounds of lean muscle now wasted by hunger. Her ears, usually regal and upright, were pressed flat against her skull. She wasn't alone. Tucked beneath her belly, shielded by her chest and the curve of her tail, were 3 tiny pups. Barely more than a few, weeks old. They were whimpering, their cries thin and fragile against the roar of the storm. Lucas froze. He expected her to growl, to bared her teeth in a desperate display of maternal aggression. Instead, the dog, whom Lucas would later name Shadow, slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were a haunting, deep amber, rimmed with frost. There was no fire in them, only a devastating, articulate plea for mercy. It was the look of a mother who had accepted her death but refused to accept the death of her children. "Easy, girl," Lucas whispered, his breath blossoming into a thick cloud. He moved slowly, sinking to his knees in the deep snow. The cold bit through his tactical pants, but he didn't feel it. He reached out a gloved hand. Shadow didn't flinch. She simply watched him with those amber eyes, her body trembling so hard he could hear her teeth chattering. Lucas reached into the hock and gently scooped up the first puppy, a small, dark ball of fur. He tucked it inside his heavy, Gore-Tex patrol jacket, pressing it against his chest where his own body heat could reach it. As he reached back for the second pup, something happened that shattered the icy barricade around his heart. Shadow leaned forward, her neck stretching out with agonizing effort, and she softly, delicately licked the back of his bare wrist where his glove had slipped down. The touch was warm, damp, and incredibly light. It was a gesture of profound trust, a thank you from a creature with nothing left to give. In that moment, the phantom gunfire in Lucas's head went silent. The icy weight in his chest, the one he had carried since Marcus died, seemed to crack. He worked quickly now, his movements fueled by a sudden, desperate purpose. He carried the 3 pups to the SUV, nesting them on the passenger floorboard where the heater was blasting. Then he returned for the mother. "Come on, Shadow. Let's get out of the cold." He had to lift her. She was heavier than she looked, her body stiff with the early stages of hypothermia. He grunted as he heaved her into the spacious back seat. She collapsed onto the leather, her eyes never leaving him. As Lucas climbed back into the driver's seat and put the vehicle in gear, he looked at the resignation letter on his visor. He didn't tear it up, not yet, but he felt a connection had just been formed, a reason to drive home instead of plunging into the abyss. The SUV began its slow descent down the mountain, leaving the lethal heights of Pinecrest Pass behind. Inside the cabin, for the first time in 18 months, the silence was no longer filled with the sound of war, but with the rhythmic, huffing breath of a family that had been given a second chance. The tires of the Ford Expedition churned through the thick, unplowed snow of the long driveway leading to Lucas's cabin. Situated at the edge of the Blackwood Ridge Valley, the structure was a modest, rugged affair of dark cedar and fieldstone, its silhouette barely visible against the churning white void of the storm. Lucas parked as close to the porch as possible, the engine's dying groan swallowed instantly by the wind. His priority was absolute. He didn't think about his frozen fingers or the dull ache in his knees. He moved with the frantic precision of a man back in the field. He carried the puppies in first, their tiny bodies still tucked inside his jacket, and laid them on a nest of wool blankets near the cold fireplace. He then returned for Shadow, his broad shoulders straining as he lifted her from the back seat. She was limp, her breathing shallow and ragged, her scent a mixture of wet fur and the metallic tang of dried blood. As he kicked the heavy oak door shut, against the howling frost, he found he wasn't alone. A soft, amber glow already emanated from the kitchen, and the scent of slow-simmered cedarwood and roasted onions hung in the air. Standing by the stove was Martha, a woman who looked like she was carved from the very mountains they inhabited. Martha was 72, short and stout, with a face like a dried apple, wrinkled but sweet, and eyes the color of a clear morning sky. She wore a heavy, hand-knitted plum cardigan over a floral house dress, her silver hair pulled back into a practical, tight bun. Martha had been a fixture of the valley for decades, known for her uncanny ability to sense trouble before it arrived. She was a woman of quiet strength, a widow who had buried her husband years ago but refused to bury her kindness with him. "I saw your lights through the trees, Lucas," Martha said, her voice a soothing contralto that cut through his adrenaline. "I figured a man like you would forget to eat when the world is ending. I brought some beef stew and—" She stopped mid-sentence as she saw the large, broken creature in Lucas's arms. Her eyes widened, but she didn't panic. Instead, she immediately pulled a pile of clean quilts from the linen closet. "Lord, have mercy. Get her to the hearth, son. I'll get the water boiling." Together, they worked in a rhythmic silence that Lucas hadn't shared with another human in years. Martha focused on the puppies, carefully feeding them warmed goat's milk through a dropper she happened to have in her basket, while Lucas knelt beside Shadow. As the fire he built began to roar, casting dancing orange shadows against the log walls, the warmth revealed the true extent of the dog's trauma. Beneath the matted sable fur of her hind leg, Lucas found a horrific sight, a deep, jagged laceration that went nearly to the bone. It wasn't a tear from a rock or a bite from a predator. The skin was pinched and sliced in a way that only one thing could cause. A leg hold. "Trap!" Lucas hissed, his jaw tightening until it ached. "Illegal poachers. She's been dragging this for miles." Martha sat back on her heels, watching Lucas as he retrieved his tactical medical kit from his duty bag. She watched him work with a steady hand, cleaning the wound with antiseptic and preparing to stitch the jagged edges. "You have the hands of your father, Lucas," she said softly, "and the eyes of my Henry." Lucas paused, the needle hovering over the skin. Martha's husband, Henry, had been a sergeant in the same precinct 30 years prior. "Henry used to come home with that same shadow in his eyes," she continued, her voice drifting like wood smoke. "After he survived that warehouse fire that took his partner, he sat in that very chair for 3 months, wondering why he was the one who got to walk out. He thought survival was a debt he couldn't pay. But it wasn't a debt, Lucas. It was a mission. He realized he survived so he could be the one to teach the rookies how to stay alive. He found a new reason to wear the badge." Lucas didn't answer immediately. He focused on the stitching, his flint-gray eyes fixed on the task. But Martha's words settled into the quiet spaces of his mind. For months, he had viewed his life as a mistake of fate, a man who stayed behind while Marcus moved on. But as he looked at Shadow, who had endured a steel trap and a blizzard just to keep her pups breathing, he felt a strange, new weight in his hands. It wasn't the weight of a gun or a badge. It was the weight of a life that depended entirely on his refusal to give up. As the night deepened and the blizzard rattled the window panes, Lucas began to notice something peculiar. Shadow was regaining consciousness, her amber eyes tracking his every move. To test her alertness, he stood up and, out of habit, used a hand signal, a flat palm facing downward, the universal canine command for "stay." Shadow's ears flickered and she instantly pressed her body flatter against the rug, her eyes locking onto his with a sharp, disciplined focus. Lucas frowned. He leaned in closer and whispered a soft German command he hadn't used since his training days. "Platz." Immediately, the dog's head dropped between her paws. She didn't just lie down. She executed the command with a crispness that spoke of hundreds of hours of professional training. Lucas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "She's not a stray, Martha," he whispered. "She's a K9. She's one of us." He looked at the scars on her neck, hidden beneath the thick fur, marks where a heavy tactical collar had once rested. The realization that this noble animal, a highly trained servant of the law, had been left to die in a trap on a frozen mountain ridge ignited a slow, simmering fury in his gut. Martha walked over and placed a warm, wrinkled hand on his shoulder. Maybe she was lost, or maybe she was discarded when she wasn't useful anymore. People can be cruel to things they think are broken, Lucas. But look at her. She's still a mother. She's still a protector. She just needed someone to recognize the badge she's still wearing in her heart. Lucas looked from the dog to the resignation letter he had tossed onto the kitchen table earlier. He thought about the silence of the mountains and the crack of the gunfire that haunted him. Then he looked at the 3 puppies, now sleeping in a warm heap, and the brave mother who had licked his hand in the snow. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't the silence of an empty grave. It was the silence of a sanctuary. "I won't let them take her," Lucas said, his voice no longer a whisper, but a vow. He picked up a bowl of Martha's stew, finally feeling the hunger he had ignored for days. He sat on the floor next to the hearth, leaning his back against the stone, and for the first time in 18 months, he didn't hear the phantom shots. He only heard the crackle of the fire and the steady, rhythmic breathing of a pack that had found its way home. The morning light that finally broke over Blackwood Ridge was blinding, a sharp, crystalline glare reflecting off the 4 feet of fresh powder that had buried the valley. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the hearth still lingered, but the peace Lucas had found during the night was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of boots on his porch. Lucas, who had been dozing in a chair by the fire, was on his feet before the first knock echoed through the room. Shadow was equally alert, standing on 3 legs with her hackles raised, a low, guttural vibration beginning deep in her chest as she positioned herself between the door and her sleeping pups. When Lucas opened the door, he was met by a man who looked like he was composed entirely of iron and bureaucracy. Inspector Miller was in his late 50s, a high-ranking official from the State Wildlife Bureau. He was a man of medium height but possessed a rigid, military posture that made him seem taller. His face was deeply lined, tanned to the color of old leather, with a thin, severe mustache that matched his iron-gray hair. Miller's eyes were small, dark, and as cold as the mountain runoff, reflecting a life spent enforcing regulations without the interference of sentiment. He wore the forest green uniform of his department, every crease sharp enough to cut, and a heavy parka with the official state seal prominently displayed. Miller was not a man who enjoyed his job. He was a man who performed it with a mechanical, unyielding devotion to the letter of the law. "Officer Thorne," Miller began, his voice a dry rasp that didn't bother with a greeting. "I received a report from the county plow driver about a stray canine on your property. A large German shepherd, potentially aggressive. I'm here for a mandatory inspection." He stepped into the cabin without waiting for an invitation, his eyes immediately locking onto Shadow. The dog responded with a sharp, warning bark, her amber eyes flashing with protective fire as she stood over Bolt, Daisy, and Pepper. Miller clicked his tongue and pulled a notepad from his pocket. "Unregistered, unvaccinated, and exhibiting territorial aggression. According to State Regulation 402, animals of unknown origin displaying such behavior in a residential zone must be impounded immediately for rabies testing or, if deemed a public threat, humane euthanasia." The words hit the room like a sudden frost. Lucas felt the old heat of a different kind of battle rising in his chest. "She's not a stray, Miller. She's an injured animal I rescued from Pinecrest Pass. She's protecting her litter. Any mother would do the same." Miller didn't look up from his notes. "The law doesn't differentiate between motherly instinct and public liability, officer. Without ownership papers or a current medical history, this animal is a state ward. My transport van is at the end of your drive. I'll be taking her and the offspring now." Lucas stepped forward, his broad frame casting a long shadow over the inspector. "I'm a peace officer in this town, Miller. I'm telling you, this dog is a former K-9. She understands commands. She's served the law." "Then where is her badge, Thorne?" Miller countered, finally looking up with a cold, hollow stare. "Where is the paperwork? Until you can produce a registered handler's certificate, she's just a dangerous stray in a uniform's house. Don't make this difficult. You know the protocols." As Miller reached for a heavy, retractable catch-pole, a long metal rod with a wire noose, Lucas felt the world narrow down to a single point of focus. It was the same focus he had felt in the desert and again during the shootout with Marcus. He stepped directly between Miller and the dog's makeshift bed, his hand resting near his belt, though not on his weapon. His posture was unmistakable. He was no longer a weary man. He was a wall of muscle and intent. "You want to take her," Lucas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that mirrored Shadow's growl. "Then you're going to have to go through me. And I promise you, Miller, I don't move easily." The tension in the room was a physical weight. Miller froze, the catchpole halfway extended. He saw the flinty, uncompromising light in Lucas's gray eyes, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Outside, the sound of a second vehicle approaching broke the stalemate. Officer Davis, a younger cop from Lucas's precinct, stepped into the doorway. Davis was 24, lanky, with a face still holding a hint of boyish roundness and hair he kept just a bit too long for regulation. He was a good kid, though usually prone to following the path of least resistance. He looked between his senior officer and the grim inspector with visible nervousness. "Lucas, the chief sent me," Davis stammered, his eyes darting to Shadow. "Word got out about the dog. The guys at the station. They're saying you're losing it, man. Keeping a wild animal after what happened to Marcus? The chief wants you to let the Bureau handle it. He said it's for your own good." Lucas didn't even look at Davis. His eyes stayed locked on Miller. "Tell the chief I'm more sane than I've been in years, and tell him if he wants this dog he can come tell me himself." Miller finally retracted the pole with a sharp metallic click. He recognized he wasn't going to win this standoff without a violent escalation, something even a man of his rigid nature wanted to avoid. He checked his watch, his face a mask of bureaucratic disdain. 48 hours, Thorne," Miller spat. "The law gives a grace period of 48 hours for found property verification. If you don't have a handler's deed or a state-certified ownership transfer by Monday morning, I'm coming back with the sheriff and a warrant. And at that point, I won't just be taking the dog, I'll be filing a report on your fitness for duty." Miller turned on his heel and marched out into the snow. Davis lingered for a second, looking at Lucas with a mix of pity and confusion. "Is she worth it, Lucas? Your career?" "She's worth more than the career, Davis," Lucas replied, his voice softening only slightly. "Go back to the station." Once the door was shut, Lucas didn't collapse. He moved to his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys as he accessed the National K-9 Registry. He began a deep dive into defunct units and retired service animal logs. He remembered the faint, jagged scar on Shadow's neck, the mark of a specific type of heavy tactical collar used by the now-disbanded Sentinel Group in a neighboring state. He worked through the afternoon, fueled by Martha's leftover coffee and a desperate, burning need to prove the world wrong. By nightfall, he found it. A grainy photo in a 3-year-old news article about a budget-cut liquidation. There she was, younger and standing proudly next to a handler who had since passed away. Her service name was Shadow 7. She was a decorated veteran of a search and rescue unit that had been shut down, her records lost in a sea of red tape. She wasn't just a stray, she was a hero who had been forgotten by the very system Miller represented. Lucas sat back, his eyes stinging. He looked over at Shadow, who had finally relaxed enough to let her pups nurse. She had protected the state once. Now it was his turn to protect her from the state. He had 36 hours left. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for the regional records office. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Lucas Thorne knew exactly what he was fighting for. The 48-hour ultimatum hung over the cabin like a guillotine, but it was Shadow's own primal instincts that acted first. In the dead of night, while the moonlight painted the snow in shades of ghostly blue, the German shepherd made a choice. She had seen the metal catchpole and heard the cold, predatory tone of Inspector Miller. To her, he was the scent of a cage. Despite the stitches Lucas had painstakingly placed in her leg, the drive to disappear was stronger than the pain. When Lucas fell into a brief, exhausted sleep at his desk, Shadow nudged the rear latch, a trick she had learned in her K-9 training days, and slipped out into the freezing Montana wilderness, her 3 puppies trailing behind her like silent shadows. Lucas woke 2 hours later to a cabin that felt cavernously empty. The wool blankets were cold, and the rhythmic breathing that had become his new heartbeat was gone. Panic, sharp and cold, flared in his chest. He grabbed his tactical parka and stepped onto the porch, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to find 4 sets of tracks leading straight toward the Blackwood Ravine, a treacherous stretch of land where the earth was unstable and the drops were vertical. He was about to sprint into the tree line when a pair of headlights flickered at the edge of his drive. It was Inspector Miller's state truck. Miller stepped out, but the iron-gray rigidity of his posture seemed slightly softened by the moonlight. He didn't have his clipboard or his catchpole. Instead, he held a handheld thermal GPS unit. "I've been sitting at the trailhead for an hour, Thorne," Miller said, his voice lacking its previous bureaucratic bite. "I saw her move. I was going to call it in, but I saw how she carried that smallest pup by the scruff when it stumbled. It reminded me of a dog I had when I was a boy." He handed the device to Lucas. "She's heading for the unstable ridge near the old quarry. If you don't get to her before the temperature drops another 10 degrees, the pups won't make it. I've bypassed the department's tracking log. As far as the Bureau knows, I'm at home in bed." Lucas took the device, nodding a silent thanks that bridged the gap between their conflicting worlds. He was joined moments later by Martha, who had arrived in her old 4x4, her face grim. "The mountain is shifting, Lucas," she warned, pointing toward the ravine. "The melt from the day has made the underside of the snow slick. It's a death trap out there." Despite her age, Martha's resolve was unshakable. She acted as the anchor, staying at the ridge's edge with a high-powered lantern to guide Lucas's return. Following the thermal pings, Lucas reached the edge of the ravine. The sight was harrowing. Shadow was trapped on a narrow, crumbling shelf 30 feet below the main ridge. A small rock slide had pinned her injured leg under a slab of shale, and the shelf was beginning to groan under the weight of the shifting snow. The puppies were huddled in a crevice behind her, their tiny whimpers nearly drowned out by the sound of sliding gravel. "I'm coming down," Lucas shouted. He hammered a piton into a sturdy pine and clipped his rappelling line to his harness. As he descended into the black throat of the ravine, the earth began to give way. Small pebbles turned into a cascade of dirt. He reached the shelf just as a significant section of the ridge above groaned. Miller was at the top now, leaning over the edge with Sequan Davis, who had arrived after hearing the radio chatter. Lucas reached Shadow, but the shale pinning her was too heavy to move quickly. "Easy, girl," he grunted, bracing his back against the cold stone and using his legs to shift the slab. As the dog's leg came free, a thunderous crack echoed from above. A massive shelf of snow and rock, a localized avalanche, was beginning to slide directly toward their position. There was no time to climb. Lucas unclipped his secondary safety line and wrapped it around Shadow, shouting for those above to haul. "Take the dogs! Pull!" he roared. He scooped the 3 puppies into his reinforced tactical vest and shielded Shadow with his own body as the first wave of debris hit. Lucas felt the world turn to a crushing weight of ice and stone. He didn't let go. He curled his broad frame over the German shepherd, burying his face in her sable fur, accepting that this might be the end. He whispered a silent apology to Marcus and a silent prayer for the animals in his arms. The rope went taut with a violent jerk. Miller, Davis, and 2 other officers who had arrived as backup threw their collective weight into the line. They hauled with a desperation that ignored departmental protocols and safety regulations. Lucas felt himself being dragged upward through a slurry of snow just seconds before the entire shelf collapsed into the abyss below. When they reached the top, Lucas was dragged over the edge, gasping for air, his face bloodied and his dark hair white with pulverized ice. He was still clutching the puppies to his chest, and Shadow was shivering violently but alive beside him. The officers stood in a circle, their breath clouding in the freezing air, looking down at the man who had nearly died for a dangerous stray. Inspector Miller walked over, his boots crunching on the crusty snow. He looked at the family of dogs, then at Lucas's battered hands. Without a word, Miller reached out and helped Lucas to his feet. "You're a fool, Thorne," Miller muttered, but there was a flicker of genuine respect in his dark eyes. "But you're a fool who keeps his word." Miller turned to the other officers, his voice regaining its authoritative rasp. "I want a perimeter set. Nobody mentions the avalanche or the unauthorized rescue in the official log. As far as the report goes, the dog was secured peacefully at the residence." Davis stepped forward, his boyish face pale from the adrenaline. "We've got the heater. Going in the transport, Lucas. Let's get them back to your place." As they moved toward the vehicles, Martha wrapped a heavy quilt around Lucas's shoulders. The gunfire in his head was gone, replaced by the heavy, grounding weight of the life he had just saved. The mountain had tried to take him, but for the first time in 18 months, Lucas Thorne had fought back and won. He looked at Shadow, who was limping toward the truck, and he knew the 48-hour clock didn't matter anymore. They were a pack now. The frost that had once held Blackwood Ridge in a skeletal grip finally succumbed to the persistent warmth of May. The melting snow didn't just flood the creeks, it seemed to wash away the lingering soot of the winter's hardships. At the edge of the valley, Lucas Thorne's cabin had undergone a transformation as profound as the man himself. The old, weathered wood had been scrubbed and treated, and the surrounding acreage was now neatly enclosed by sturdy cedar fences. A hand-carved wooden sign hung above the gate, swinging gently in the mountain breeze. Thorne's Sanctuary, for the brave and the broken. The legal battle for Shadow had been a quiet victory, won not in a courtroom, but in the dimly lit offices of the Regional Records Bureau. Inspector Miller, true to the silent vow he had made on the side of that crumbling ravine, had personally delivered the verified K-9 service records and the transfer of ownership papers. It turned out Shadow's original handler had died, without kin, and the system had simply let her slip through the cracks. Miller had navigated the red tape with the surgical precision of a man making amends. On the day the papers were signed, Miller had appeared at the cabin one last time in his professional capacity. He looked at Lucas, then at the healthy German shepherd sitting at Lucas's side, and simply tipped his cap. "The state has no further interest in this animal, Officer Thorne," he had said, a rare, genuine smile tugging at his severe mustache. "In fact, the state is grateful for your specialized care." Lucas had decided to stay on the force, but the resignation letter was no longer on his visor. It had been burned in the hearth months ago. He realized that his experience with PTSD and his bond with Shadow gave him a unique perspective that the department desperately needed. With the chief's blessing and a small grant for veteran outreach, Lucas had turned his property into a rehabilitation center. It was a place where retired K-9s, often discarded or misunderstood after their years of high-stress service, could find peace, and where officers struggling with the invisible wounds of the job could find a silent, furry confidant who understood the weight of a heavy heart. Joining this mission was Sarah Vance, the town's newest veterinarian who had moved from the city seeking a quieter life. Sarah was in her late 30s, tall and slender with an athletic grace, her auburn hair usually tied back in a messy ponytail. She had a sharp, brilliant mind and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, though her eyes held the quiet patience of someone who had seen too much pain in the animal kingdom. Sarah had become a fixture at the sanctuary, providing medical care and helping Lucas develop training programs that focused on healing rather than apprehension. She was a woman of deep empathy, often seen sitting on the grass, patiently earning the trust of the most traumatized rescues. Her presence added a layer of professional hope to the sanctuary, and her growing friendship with Lucas provided him with a mirror to see the progress he was making in his own soul. Martha had moved into the small guest cottage on the property, taking on the role of the sanctuary's heart and soul. She was the house mother, ensuring that both the humans and the dogs were well fed and emotionally grounded. Her kitchen always smelled of fresh bread and lavender. Martha believed that a full stomach was the first step toward a quiet mind, and she was rarely seen without a tray of cookies or a bowl of fresh water for the new arrivals. She watched over the puppies, Bolt, Daisy, and Pepper, as they grew from shivering dark balls of fur into robust, intelligent adolescents. Bolt, the largest, had inherited his mother's sable coat and a natural instinct to protect. Daisy was the scout, always the first to explore a new trail, and Pepper, the smallest, possessed a calm, observant nature that made her a natural at therapy work. By the time the wildflowers had fully carpeted the valley in shades of violet and gold, The sanctuary was thriving. On a particularly golden Saturday afternoon, the air was filled with the sounds of life. A retired officer from a neighboring county sat on a bench under the old oak tree, his hand resting on the head of a scarred Belgian Malinois, both of them staring at the horizon in a shared, peaceful silence. Lucas sat on his porch, his long legs stretched out before him. He wore a simple flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were still strong but no longer tense. In his hand was an old harmonica, a relic he had found in a box of Marcus's things. He began to play, a slow, soulful melody that drifted across the clearing like a prayer. It wasn't a song of war or a march for the fallen. It was a song of home. Shadow sat at his feet, her sable and black fur shining with health, her amber eyes clear and steady. She no longer limped, and the fear of the cage had long since been replaced by the security of the pack. She rested her chin on Lucas's boot, exhaling a long, contented sigh. Lucas stopped playing for a moment, looking out at the three pups as they wrestled in the tall grass with Sarah, while Martha waved from the kitchen window. He realized then that Shadow hadn't just been a rescue. She had been a messenger. She had led him through the blizzard of his own grief to show him that even the most broken things can be rebuilt into something beautiful. He wasn't a ghost in a uniform anymore. He was a protector, a builder, and a man who had finally found his way back from the cold. The valley of Blackwood Ridge was no longer a place of shadows, but a sanctuary of light. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who is going through a storm today. Let us spread hope and compassion to every corner of the world. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of faith and second chances, and don't forget to like and leave a comment. May the Lord watch over you, keep you warm in the coldest storms, and lead you to your own sanctuary of peace. Please comment Amen if you believe in second chances and the power of love. God bless you all.